Many investors may consider the supply and demand economics of Bitcoin with their analysis, but will often overlook the supply and demand of the fiat currency we actually use to buy BTC. With these charts, we can now track the expected capital inflows into the market, and things are starting to look very bullish. Today, we're going to be looking at how capital inflows into Bitcoin are likely to surge in the near future, and where better to start than the US M1 money versus Bitcoin chart we have here in our macro suite on bitcoinmagazinepro.com. And as we can see immediately, this is tracking US M1 money and its surge or decline contraction compared to BTC. And if we just scroll down here, we can actually see that M1 money is defined as notes and coins in circulation, as well as any other money equivalents. And we can see that this has obviously had a very strong causation effect with Bitcoin. The chart is slightly distorted here after COVID, when we had the huge stimulus packages, not just in the US, but pretty much globally, that absolutely rallied Bitcoin to new all-time highs in the previous cycles. What we can see is as Bitcoin had a little bit of a bear cycle, we saw this contracting and maybe limited Bitcoin's upside potential, as the supply of new fiat coming into the markets was considerably less than it historically was, and potentially due to inflation and other more bearish economic policies, people maybe didn't have the demand to go into more speculative assets, and the demand for safe haven assets such as fiat currencies maybe increased. But now we're actually seeing a little bit of a shift in this. If we just zoom into the most recent data here, we can see this has been declining practically non-stop for a number of years now. However, recently, over the past 2 months, we've seen this increase on back-to-back months. Now, I'm making this video today because in just a few days' time, we're going to have the July data for these metrics, which is really going to confirm whether we're set to see a huge amount of capital inflows into the Bitcoin markets. I think it's better and more easy to see in the US M2 money supply, but we can very clearly see the correlation between this rapidly increasing and Bitcoin's most rapid increase in the previous bull cycle, and this declining along with Bitcoin during a not great bear cycle. Now, for an even longer period of time, we've seen this continue to increase over the last few months. And the M2 money supply, again, is looking at cash, checking deposits, saving deposits, etc. So even more is taken into consideration than when looking at the US M2 money supply. And another thing to take into account, because we're obviously seeing the supply of fiat currencies, especially the US dollar, begin to start increasing, begin to start to pivot to more bullish market conditions. What we also need to take into consideration is the potential demand for these currencies. And one way to look at this is the high yield credit cycles. And this is looking at high yield bonds. So if we just come down here, it's looking at different high yielding bonds throughout the US economy. And typically when we see the demand for these bonds increasing, it signifies more risk on conditions. People don't want to hold US dollars and underperform the market, underperform inflation. They want to have a little bit of return on their wealth and capital. So once we actually see this rapidly increase, like we see pretty much at the start of every Bitcoin bull cycle, indicates that sentiment has definitely shifted in traditional markets to more risk on sentiment. And when it's declining, obviously this aligns very nicely with Bitcoin bear cycles. But what we've seen in this cycle is a little bit of a choppy consolidationary period. We've not seen the very cyclical moves we usually see, where it's a very nice, slow, pretty easy to spot moves in this metric. We've been very low and pretty choppy for a number of years, really. And this is definitely due to the uncertainties in politics, global economies. Pretty much everything you can think of that hasn't looked great over the past few years is leading to investors maybe being a little bit more tentative when it comes to their investments. However, we're now starting to see this uptick over the past few weeks. So it'll be very interesting to keep an eye on this metric, as we've recently set a high we haven't seen since August 2022. So again, definitely keep an eye on this metric over the next few weeks and months. But one thing we also need to consider is Bitcoin is a global asset. It's not just tied to the US economy. Of course, it has a huge contributing factor. But if we look to something like the global M2 money supply, which is taking into account global fiat currencies, we can see that this almost gives a much clearer indication of where we can expect to see Bitcoin go in the coming weeks and months. We can see a almost perfect correlation throughout all of Bitcoin's price cycles, as this is contracting with bear cycles and as this is expanding through bull cycles. And especially over the last few years, this has been very volatile in its expanding and contraction moves for the M2 money supply. But recently, again, we've begun to see this uptick in the M2 money supply. Previously, over the last few months, this rapid increase in this probably certainly had a little bit of a influence on us reaching a new all-time high. But as we had this most recent pullback, again, aligning with this contraction in the global M2 money supply, and then again aligning with the bounce we most recently had as this begun to increase again, this is definitely one we should be watching very closely. And if we look at the same metric but on a year-on-year basis, we can even more clearly see the cyclical moves in the nature of liquidity cycles, again aligning very nicely, coincidentally, forcefully with the Bitcoin 4-year cycles. We see this rapidly increase very much alongside Bitcoin, rapidly decrease again alongside Bitcoin's bear cycles. And now, exactly as Bitcoin's price bottomed out, this rapidly begun increasing again as Bitcoin entered its new bull cycle. And now we're beginning to see this continue increasing after a little bit of a retracement. So everything is pointing towards very bullish market conditions, very positive macro environment for investors and risk on sentiment for more speculative assets like Bitcoin. And like I said, as the new data is just a few days away, especially for the US economy, which is obviously going to have quite a big factor on everything else we've seen today, it's very important to keep an eye on these metrics over the coming weeks and months, because if things continue to be bullish, if things pivot to an even more bullish macro environment, then we're bound to have an incredibly bullish next few weeks and months with a much higher upside potential for BTC. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the resources we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on bitcoinmagazinepro.com, your number one source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, tracking global fiat supply increases or decreases allows us to better predict the upcoming macro environment for trade markets, including Bitcoin. And historically, we've seen a very strong correlation between M1 or M2 money supplies increasing and very bullish conditions for BTC, as well as traditional assets. This isn't just impacting BTC, but indexes like the S&P 500 and all the stocks within them, as well as potentially gold and other store of value assets. And this is due to the decreasing demand for holding fiat as investors look for alternative avenues for storing their wealth and to potentially grow their capital. And like we could see with the high yield credit cycles, we're beginning to see a shift in the sentiment to a more risk-on environment after consecutive years really of a little bit more tentative approach to the markets. If you liked this video, then please visit bitcoinmagazinepro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price, including all of the macro suite tools we've used today, as well as the portfolio tools, which we didn't touch on today, but again, has lots of cool charts in there for you to do your analysis with. And let me know what your thoughts are on the current macro environment, both in the US and globally. Do you think we're setting up for a very bullish Q3 and Q4 in the markets? Or are you maybe thinking that now isn't the time to be too bullish? Maybe we're going to have a little bit of a pivot to more bearish conditions, of course, with a little bit of political global uncertainty. There's always that chance that conditions maybe aren't so favorable. But as I said, let me know in the comments below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to all of them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.